Resuming debate, the honourable member Scarborough-Guildwood.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate this opportunity to address the fall economic statement. Recently, I had the honor and privilege to go to Washington with the Defense Committee. I see my friend from Calgary, Rocky Ridge here. He too was on the trip, and I want to just say I want to thank the ambassador publicly for her contributions to the utility of our trip. They couldn't have treated us better. We went to the Wilson Center, we went to the Pentagon, we went to the Atlantic Center, among other meetings. And in terms of defense context, Washington is, frankly, the center of the geopolitical universe. In addition to chairing the Defense Committee, I also chair the Permanent Joint Board of Defense, co-chair it really, which harkens back to the times actually of Roosevelt and Mackenzie King. I want to assure honourable members that I was not chairing that board at that time. But I'm having some pushback from the member from Kingston Islands on that. It's an opportunity on an annual basis for our respective militaries to exchange public policy issues, particularly update their own military policies. The American government has just updated its military policy, and the Canadian government is about to update its strong, secure, and engaged policy because, frankly, Madam Speaker, the threat environment has changed dramatically in the last 24 months. So you may, or the last 12 months really. So you may wonder why I want to talk about or I start a speech about the fall economic statement by reference to defense. The reason is that over the course of these many meetings, Madam Speaker, we started to joke, I started to joke that we really should rename the Defense Committee to be the Defense, Trade and Commerce Committee, because it is not merely the threats that Canada and other Western nations are facing are not merely threats that relate to what you would describe as security and military threats. Rather, they are societal, economic, and business threats, which are in fact far more insidious and multifaceted than merely standalone military and security threats. It was pretty clear that when we arrived in Washington, the Americans regard China as what's called the pacing threat. And the pacing threat is the threat to which you have to maintain your technological, military, etc. superiority. They clearly regard Russia as an acute threat. Clearly it can do damage, but it doesn't penetrate into the threat analysis in the same way that does China. The pacing threat that China creates, if you will, a gray zone of conflict. And this is where it relates to our fall economic statement, because in the gray zone of conflict, there is an economics challenge, there is a business challenge, there is a democracy challenge, there is an intellectual property challenge, there is a rule of law challenge, and we could actually isolate many more. The PRC uses all of these areas of access points to undermine the very fabric of our society, to steal when it's appropriate to steal, to loot when it's appropriate to loot, to sow disinformation when it's appropriate to sow disinformation, and anything of any value gets returned to Beijing one way or another, and they in turn take those intellectual, scientific, and technological advantages that we currently enjoy and use them against our Western societies. Those who briefed us expressed a real worry that we need to keep ahead. A Cold War mentality is setting in, but unlike the Cold War mentality of the mutually assured destruction that existed between the USSR and the US in times past, it's rather from top to bottom, layer by layer contest over anything of any value in Western societies. And there is a huge advantage for the Communist Party of China because it is a closed society. Ours are relatively open societies. And the contest is heavily weighted in favor of a closed society that has a unitary view of dominance at all costs, a wish to turn us all into vassal states. I just in sharing our intellectual resources, Madam Speaker, you'll see that our universities are relatively open. The concept in Western society is that you share knowledge with a view to building knowledge. And the real question is, can we actually continue that? And the argument, if you are looking at this from a threat analysis standpoint, is that we can't. We have a patent regime that exists to protect investor and property rights. And again, for a society that routinely abuses the patents that exist and pays no and takes no responsibility to compensate the creator, that is a system that may not continue to be able to exist. Further, we have open real estate markets, and we've heard a lot about the cost of living. Well, what is in part driving the cost of living, Madam Speaker, are massive infusions of monies from abroad, somewhat from China in particular, that drive up the prices of housing, and that in turn makes housing unaffordable to our own population, and distorts, if you will, our entire market system. That can't continue. We have an open investor system in mines and minerals. Again, we can't allow state-owned enterprises to own critical minerals and critical mines. We have an open democracy. We can't continue with the misinformation and voter influence campaigns that are run from the People's Republic of China. And so when we hear the threat analysis from the people in the Pentagon and leading thinkers in all of these institutions, you realize that all of these layers of threat are significant to our way of life and significant to the prosperity that, frankly, is reflected in our fall economic statement. So these are just a few examples of the layered threats that go right from a traditional military threat right through to abuse of our democracy. So, Madam Speaker, I looked at the fall economic statement, compared it to the Parliamentary Budget Officer's view of the same set of numbers, and frankly, there's not a great deal of difference between the two. Occasionally, the government is a little bit more optimistic than the PBO, and on occasion, the PBO is a little bit more optimistic than the government. But on several layers, we are necessarily just simply going to have to adjust. So capital flows from the PRC are going to have to be restricted, and these capital flows will have to be replaced internally or from abroad, probably primarily from the U.S. And in fact, the United States military has set up a fund where it invests, it's available to invest in various technologies, but also various mines and minerals that will be needed for the need to keep ahead of the pacing threat. I have a relative, for instance, who is in a leading research company, and the Department of Defense is actually one of the significant investors in that company. Rare earth minerals require a lot of capital and are critical to the 21st century economy. They're also critical to weapons technology. Canada is treated as a domestic supplier for defense procurement. We will start to draw down on that status much more vigorously as we reshore, we nearshore, and friendshore critical investments. So I see, Madam Speaker, that you're hinting that my time might be finished. and before you pull it down, I will. So thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The honourable member for Calgary Shepherd.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So I was following along with the member's speech with the member from Calgary Rocky Ridge, and we have just one observation to make to the member, that according to the government's own fall economic statement, in about 7 years, within 7 years, we will pay more in debt interest payments than we do right now for the Defense Department's annual budget. So if the member is as concerned as we are with the national security of Canada and ensuring we can protect our country into the future, shouldn't the government get a control of debt interest payments and ensure it's not taking on even more debt, thus assuring that entire government departments will be gobbled up by debt interest payments to the big banks?
The honourable member for Scarborough-Guildwood.
I just take a note, Madam Speaker, that the government has actually handled their debt management quite shrewdly by buying, when the interest rates were low, long-term bonds. And that's actually brought our management of debt into line. I also encourage the honourable member to look at comparators with other nations. And if there is any other nation that wishes to have the debt to GDP ratio that Canada has, I'd be interested in the honourable member telling me who it might be.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for London Fanshawe.
Madam Speaker, and I will try to take no offense to the fact that my honourable colleague forgot to mention that I too was on that trip, but I did get quite a lot out of it, of course. It was fascinating. One of the things too that our Defence Committee is studying is of course about Arctic sovereignty, and how Canada is investing into NORAD, into its modernization, and our role in that. But of course, we've heard a lot about how we can continue to monitor or be that partner in NORAD to help with the security that's at threat through the Arctic, to the Arctic, and in the Arctic. And while we are focusing as Defence Committee on through, and Canada's role in that, maybe he could talk about some of the investments that his government needs to make and hasn't made in the Arctic. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Scarborough-Guildwood.
I offer to my colleague an insincere apology for not seeing her down at the other end of the chamber, hiding behind her mask, but that's another thing altogether. And I do appreciate her contribution to the Defence Committee. The investments in the Arctic are necessarily going to be massive. As climate change takes hold, the reality is that the Arctic is opening up. And Canadians need to get their heads around the notion that we are going to, not only as a defense initiative, invest heavily in the Arctic, but we need to build ports, we need to use the facilities that we have. It's going to be extremely expensive to build the new early warning system and a massive technological enterprise.
We have time for a brief question. The honourable for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And the member mentioned resource extraction and expansion of that. And alongside that critical mineral expansion, is there a plan from this Liberal government to protect Indigenous women and girls from exploitation and man camps, and that all of those things that come alongside resource extraction that have never been considered by this government in the past?
The honourable for Scarborough-Guildwood has just a little over a minute to respond.
Actually, one of the, I think, unique advantages that Canada has is the way in which, particularly the Canadian military, has integrated Indigenous people into the Rangers and into the larger military. They, in effect, create our sovereignty presence in the North. And there's been a great deal of conversation about how to do it appropriately. I see as the Arctic opens up that this is a unique opportunity to get it right with Indigenous folks. And frankly, the testimony before the Defence Committee to date has been that we are starting to get it right, and the consultations are real and meaningful. And I would like to be optimistic about it.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Niagara Falls.